Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast, conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now podcasting from scenic Colorado Springs, Colorado, here's your host, Jason Day.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast. I am your host, Jason Day, and I had the opportunity to connect with Thom Schultz this week. Thom is the president and founder of Group Publishing and Lifetree Cafe. He's the author of many books, including Why Nobody Wants to Go to Church Anymore and The One Thing. He's the director of the documentary film When God Left the Building. Thom is also the founder of Group Serves, which organizes volunteer mission experiences to help disadvantaged families throughout the world. Thom shares regularly on his blog and podcast at holysoup.com, where he challenges the status quo in ministry and life. Now, in this week's episode, Thom and I discuss one of the most effective ways to both reach your community and raise up volunteers in your church. Thom shares innovative ways to approach ministry to kids during these challenging times. And Thom also explains why he thinks the ministry opportunities for your church this summer might be the most important in your entire lifetime. These are great insights from a great leader that you'll want to definitely pass along. So now please join me in my conversation with Thom Schultz. Thom, welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast. So happy that you could join us.
Great to be with you.
Thom, your company is one that is very, very well known. I'm sure that most every pastor and ministry listener listening in right now, ministry leader listening in right now, is familiar with your organization, Group Publishing. It's one of the largest providers of Vacation Bible School, VBS curriculum in the world, and so many different publications and resources for local churches. And for many churches, VBS is actually one of their biggest outreach events that they have all year long, and it's one of the things that oftentimes you have a lot of volunteers who are excited, because I think a lot of us remember maybe back when we were kids and we experienced VBS, and so it's just an incredible opportunity to connect with people in the community. Can you talk to us a little bit? I'm just curious about how many churches actually do VBS or some type of Vacation Bible School outreach ministry each year.
Yeah, our estimates are that there's about 60 to 70,000 churches in the U.S. right now that are doing VBS. Some of those are combined. So in some communities, there are 2, 3, 4, 5 churches that get together and have a VBS in one location at one time.
Oh, yeah, that's excellent. And even bringing up that point, Thom, it's kind of a beautiful way that churches can collaborate.
Yeah.
They can come together and really do something for their community. And kind of pool their resources. So I think that's a beautiful picture of the church. What would you say is kind of the role of VBS in a church's overall outreach strategy? I mean, why does VBS matter to a local church?
Yeah. I think for many churches, like you alluded to, this is the biggest event for children and families during the year. And it's a combination of reaching your own people in your own congregation, as well as an outreach to the community. It's one of the most visible, one of the most meaningful times to gather children together to bask in God's love and to learn about Him and to grow together. And I think those churches that have seen that as such a pivotal time, it's sort of like the engine for the whole rest of the year in terms of attracting families and helping the kids in those families really grow closer to God, and that winds up affecting the whole family unit. There are so many stories we hear every year of kids who get introduced to God and to that church during summer VBS, and then their families who may not have been churched before wind up coming to church because of that connection during the summer. So it's a very powerful ministry.
Yeah, and one of the things that I always recognized as a pastor was that it had the power in regard to reaching new families, which was hugely important to us. But it also did something unique in helping raise up oftentimes new volunteers They're volunteers who maybe weren't connected in some type of serving capacity in the church. And for some reason, VBS was one of those things that we could use as kind of an onboarding process for new volunteers or people who are new in the church but had not yet found a place to serve. Can you talk to us a little bit about the power of how it almost can disciple our own people as they're serving in ministry?
It's such an attractive and fun ministry, and so many adults plug into that. They see that their own gifts, their own interests can be used because VBS is filled with so much variety. If an adult loves music and kids, they can plug in with that. If they love hands-on, crafty kinds of things, they can plug in to that. If they love games, they can plug into that. If they're into cooking and snacks, they can plug into that. So there are so many different roles that they can take that they love. And then once they get around the kids and see all the excitement and the life change that happens during that week, it is very motivating for volunteers. And one of the things that we've noticed over the years that is so heartwarming is at the end of the week, how many volunteers step up and say, will you sign me up for next year? And that's a true testament to how that has affected their lives and ties them into an important ministry role that they look forward to for the whole next year.
Yeah, that's excellent, Tom. One of the things I've appreciated is that Vacation Bible School, and you guys do this very well, is that it's not just, kind of a cookie cutter approach, although you have all kinds of resources that churches can almost plug and play. VBS can be very much contextualized to the church setting, to the neighborhood setting, whether it's a rural church or an urban church, right? Whether it's, a 5 evenings a week program, or a church can kind of flex it and make it, a day program, or they could do a long weekend type thing. Talk to me about how churches have kind of taken the idea of VBS over the years and have used it in such a way where they've been able to adapt it to kind of fit in so many different areas in a way that really connects with their particular community.
Yeah, that's so true. And that's where we've seen the creativity of local churches and local leaders really come out. You mentioned things like scheduling and different formats that they can do, and they've come up with so many different formats of the traditional during the day, then in the evenings, weekend VBS. It can be one day or night a week for 5 weeks. There's so many different formats that can be done, and leaders are great at adapting to their own community, their own church size, their own volunteer base to make it work for them. The other thing that's been fun to watch in terms of creativity is VBS typically has a very colorful theme each year, and we found that the local directors and volunteers love playing out that theme and transforming their space and their time according to that theme. And the creativity they come out with that has just been fun to watch and so inspiring to see what they're doing. And it's happening all across the country and around the world as we see these themes unwrap using their own creativity.
Yeah, that's so much fun. I think of in the summers, if you're ever looking at any social media posts and you're connected to churches, you get to see all these photos of these crazy props and settings and scenes that they create to go around the theme. And that's just another way to pull in people who have gifts that they may not be able to volunteer. Maybe they work during the week, so they may not be able to volunteer. But man, on the weekend before, they're out there setting up, pirate ships or whatever it is, and preparing for it. So that's awesome. It's interesting as we're talking about the creativity and innovation of these leaders in these local churches, because obviously we find ourselves in a time where innovation is key, as we find ourselves in the midst of, as we're recording this, the COVID-19 pandemic. And a lot of churches obviously are looking for ways on how can we continue to do ministry, how can we continue to reach people in our communities, and what does that look like? And so I'm just curious, Tom, what have you been kind of hearing already from children's ministry leaders about what VBS may look like this year and how it might be different, taking into consideration, the restrictions in place, safety, responsibility, all of those things.
It's really all over the board. We've seen so many different examples of what people are planning. And we've been encouraging people to realize that as we sit here right now, VBS is still weeks or months away. And that the thing we want to do today is, rather than locking down what we think the situation is going to look like in your own community with COVID-19 and with local restrictions and so on, rather than locking down what you think that's going to look like in July or August, to take all available time you can to wait and to see what unfolds. And in the meantime, plan for several different contingencies of how you can deliver VBS. And so what do those look like? Well, we're seeing that many people are choosing a later date in the summer to allow more time for things to clear up. So if they had a June date scheduled, they're also scheduling a backup date in July or maybe August to move to if they need to. They're looking at different formats. It might be moving into the fall with their VBS on the weekend, or using an approach of once a week for 5 weeks. It might be for this summer, if your locality is limited to, let's say, no more than 10 people gathering, they're looking at finding ways to configure, either within their own church building, smaller groups like that, so that no grouping ever exceeds 10, or they're looking at doing backyard VBS formats where they can gather at people's homes in smaller groups. And then, of course, there are those who are also preparing, at least as a contingency, an online VBS at home option. And we're helping with that as well, with a very detailed guide to help people see how to do that at home if it comes to that. If gathering is not possible, then an online VBS can be done. And for that, we're really encouraging that people look at that as not simply a passive experience for kids, but a way to make it truly interactive and hands-on. One of the things we've heard already from families and from parents is that kids right now, after being locked down during this pandemic, kids are already experiencing a lot of screen fatigue. They've been staring at their screens, and parents have parked them in front of the screens of the TVs to wait this period out. And especially when we're looking forward to the summer, kids are going to be eager to look at something other than simply that screen. So if we're looking at an online option, we need to figure out ways to make that really interactive and hands-on, more than simply a passive experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's talk a little bit about that kind of online digital delivery, because we've heard some KidMin leaders who've said, yes, that would be an option, but the challenge might be getting parents at home to be engaged in such a way that it makes it kind of work for the leaders who are leading, from a distance. What recommendations would you have if a church is looking at this idea of doing some sort of a digital VBS or an online VBS? What recommendations would you give to make that as effective as possible? I know you mentioned try to make it engaging, but there are some specific ways that that you and your team are kind of thinking through, or you've already heard from some church leaders that might make that effective?
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you've already heard from some leaders and maybe from some parents about what they're anticipating or what they're experiencing already with kids at home learning, because many of them have been cooped up now for some time, helping their kids with schoolwork at home. They've become the at-home teachers, right. And some are okay with that. Others are frustrated or exhausted by that. So one of the things that we're recommending is that we give some grace to the parents and realize that we can't ask them to be super VBS directors already, right. And to be able to stage an entire VBS in their living room. They're just not going to do that. So we've got to simplify things and allow it to happen so that it continues to be not only fun for the kids, but fun and easy for the parents as well. We can't ask too much of them. We've got to make it simple. We've had the chance to experiment with this a little bit with what we've done with groups, Sunday school approaches during the past few weeks, where we've offered a free online Sunday school lesson each week, where we've really made that interactive and easy on the parents. We'll have some setup with that, where we'll say, hey, we might need a bowl of water to use in some lesson with the kids. And so parents might be involved in helping to make sure that's ready before they start the lesson. But that's all they need to do. And then the kids are instructed from the screen on interacting with that bowl of water, washing their hands or whatever it is, and engaging in the lesson. But the key is to make it easy and fun for the parents.
Yeah, that's good. I love kind of how you guys are thinking through creative ways to make it possible to be able to do kind of this ministry from a distance. That's great. When it comes to Vacation Bible School, what are some of the biggest changes that you've seen over the years as you guys have been kind of leading in this area? Yeah,
there've been a lot of changes since we've been doing VBS now for 25 years. The format that was most common back then was, for instance, a 2-week format. And we recognized back then that as more and more parents were having both parents in the workforce, the idea of having volunteers that you could tie down for 2 weeks was just getting less and less possible. So that's been one big change in America that has happened, is moving from 2 weeks to 1 week. Incidentally, we also have an office and complete publishing operation in India, and we do a lot with VBS there as well. And it's interesting there because they've done VBS there for many years as well. And that's one of the things that the common approach there is still a 2-week VBS there. And we've introduced in India also the 1-week format. And it's catching on rapidly there also because the middle class is growing rapidly in India, and they're needing the same kind of thing. So that's one example of a change. Another change that we've seen is the model that we call the rotational model, where rather than having one teacher who is supposed to know how to do everything from teaching the Bible lesson to doing crafts to doing singing to delivering the snacks and everything else, which that was the old model. We've really pushed a rotational model where kids can move from point to point during the day, and a different leader can be in each station really focusing on what they're good at. So if they love to lead games, that's all they have to do. They don't have to worry about preparing the Bible lesson and so on. So that's another thing. Another change that we've seen that has really worked, and people at the beginning didn't think it would, is mixed age groups, where the old approach to VBS was to have it heavily age graded, where you'd have all the third graders together, all the second graders together, and so on. And we've really moved to a mixed age grouping. People didn't think it would work, but when we tested it over and over again, we found not only does it work well, but it eliminates some of the other problems that we had in the past, where you'd have, a classic example of 2 5th-grade boys who were friends and were just terrors together. And that created an ongoing discipline problem. But we found that when we mixed the ages up, that it became more like a family group, and the older ones would help the younger ones would look up to the older ones, and they would learn together, have fun together, and it would also eliminate the discipline problems because you had the younger ones who would be kind of coached and held together by the older ones, and the older ones didn't want to mess up and goof off and create a problem in front of the younger ones. So it has really worked. So those are some of the structural things that we've seen really change over the years with VBS.
Yeah, that's good. And as you were talking through those, I was thinking through just in our own church in doing VBS and those types of things. And I'll tell you the one kind of the rotational model, the stations. Oh, that was a lifesaver in such a way. And we found that we could get more volunteers because they didn't feel like they had to do everything, for a particular group.
Yeah, exactly.
They could just focus on one thing, which was excellent. And we also were able to get a lot of youth to volunteer. High schoolers were really because they all wanted to do, the recreation, the games or whatever, and it's like, I get some of those teens in there to help out with that. So you got to see a lot of that kind of multi-generational and that mentoring type thing, which was a lot of fun. So a lot of changes have taken place over the years. I'm wondering, Thom, as you're kind of looking forward and thinking about the season we find ourselves in right now with the pandemic, what changes do you think might impact children's ministry that might come out of this that might be kind of lasting? Is there anything that you have seen or you've kind of thought through that might be kind of a lasting change based on what churches are experiencing right now?
Yeah, I think some of the changes that might happen are also changes that we may see happen with the church at large. I think the idea of basing ministry, or at least sensing ministry's success or effectiveness around the size of the crowd, is something that's going to affect not only children's ministry, but all ministry. Suddenly now, the idea of a crowd has lost some of its patina. People are going to have, I think, a bit of a lasting aversion to crowds. And the idea of success being the bigger the crowd is something that is going to be under challenge, I think, for the at least for the next few years as this thing goes on. And I think that'll have an impact on children's ministry as well, where children's ministry for the past past 10 years probably has in some ways tried to emulate big church. And some children's ministries have tied themselves around a presentational model where your adults and leaders would be up front and kids are expected to sit and watch what happens on the stage in a crowd, passively watching. Well, I think that's something that's going to be under challenge now, and we're going to have to rethink how we do things, and it's going to put more emphasis on smaller groups and a higher value on that relational aspect of ministry rather than on the passive crowd-based model.
Yeah, that'll be fascinating to see, and it's interesting because there is this conversation taking place right now about how do we help people kind of go deep as opposed to just reaching wide. Now, obviously, it's important for us to cast wide nets, and to live out the mission. But it seems like maybe in some of these smaller settings, it's going to kind of afford the opportunity to maybe be a little more focused, a little more intentional, because you're working with a smaller group.
Yeah.
Do you think that will have an impact on how the church kind of views disciple making even?
I do. It reminds me in some ways of the early church, and even some pockets of it. Joni and I were traveling in Turkey a few years ago, and went into the area of Cappadocia, and in that area, the early church met in these caves. They would carve their dwellings out of caves in these pointy kind of pinnacle-like rock formations. And the church was very much alive and active there, but it was limited in size because of the size of their dwellings. They couldn't make even their dwellings any larger because they were carved out of these pointy little hills. And as their churches would grow, they could hold maybe, 15, 20, 25 people. But as they got to that point and they continued to grow, then the church had to expand by starting up in another location. And they would grow in that way, but each location would be small and intimate and allow people to know one another, know what each other's needs are, know their leaders and their members in a very close way. And they were very, very strong as a church. And they were growing, but growing in a different way than we think about growth today.
Yeah, that's That's super important, and it's one of those things that sometimes we in the church we experience things that kind of awaken us to new expressions or even to old expressions. Embracing old expressions as you've mentioned, and perhaps processing through this. This crisis is going to help us to kind of again see what's vital, what's important, where are some places that we need to prioritize and spend some more time. So that's very, very helpful. In one of your recent episodes on your podcast, Holy Soup, you were talking with Max Lucado.
Yes.
And Max was kind of reflecting and asked an interesting question about coronavirus in this pandemic. And one of the things that he kind of reflected on was, is this a form of diaspora? Is this a form of God saying, okay, you become too comfortable in big buildings or nice buildings, traditional preaching? What are your thoughts on that question as we kind of look at the church at this point?
Yeah, I think how he put that is a very interesting way to think about what's happening to us today. And as much as we have fears and doubts and uncertainties about what's happening today, I have a real peace about God being in control and up to something with this. And that picture that Max painted of the diaspora of scattering, I'm curious to see if God is up to something with what's happening to the church right now, and it's worldwide. It's not simply something that's affecting our culture. Right. It's a worldwide thing, and could that idea of scattering in a good way really paint a picture for where the church is going in the future and where God wants it to go, where we become truly the priesthood of all believers, and there are more leaders, more ministry people, more people planting the church, but the church related to its original meaning of the church, and we all become church planters and leaders in small, scattered ways. I don't know. I think that it's going to be interesting to see what God does with this, and that could be.
Yeah, that's very good. Thom, can you share with us a little bit about some of the places that if people are looking for these resources that you guys provide, whether it's Vacation Bible School or some of these other resources, especially some of the creative things that you're doing now to help churches as they're ministering from a distance. What are some of those resources and where can they find those?
Yeah. You can go to group.com, and we've got, in fact, a whole section set up there for COVID-19 concerns, including a whole slew of free stuff that not only churches but parents can use in the home to help keep learning and growing happening. And then we've got what's happening with VBS in particular, and offering lots of helps there, free helps on how to make that work this year no matter what.
Excellent. And we'll have links to those resources in our show notes for our listeners. They can check those out there. Thom, do you have any final words before we close down that you might want to leave with those pastors and ministry leaders who are listening in?
Well, we started talking about the importance and significance of VBS, and I have to say that this year, I think this is the most important year ever for Vacation Bible School in our lifetimes. When you think about it from the kid perspective, kids today are through this pandemic. They're filled with fear, with confusion about what's happening. They've been separated from their friends. They have a loss of hope. My little granddaughter, who's a preschooler, after seeing kids one by one disappear from her preschool because their parents were taking them out and the preschool was preparing to close, she came home and was crying as she was being put to bed. And her mom asked her, well, what's wrong? And she said, I don't want to disappear. And she saw what was happening around her, and she was filled with fear that she was going to disappear or, in her mind, die because of what's happening around. Her grandfather, coincidentally, had died a couple of weeks earlier, so she was filled with all of this fear and loss of hope. So if there was ever a time for VBS to come into kids' lives and bring them a sense of God's love, His protection, His hope, this is it. This is our prime time for the ministry of VBS. And we are just encouraging churches, rather than even thinking about the idea of, well, maybe we won't do anything this year. This is the most important year to do VBS. We have kids who are at such a tender point, and VBS is such an important ministry for them that touches them where they are. And then when you think about the importance of outreach for a church with VBS, you have a community under stress. And if your church can be the one that steps forth and provides this hope and love and encouragement and a place for their kids to know that this is for them, and this is where they can hear about God's love, this places your church at the beacon on the hill.
Yeah, that's good. That's such a good word of encouragement for our churches, our ministry leaders, to be looking at how we can really lean in, right? Lean into this and be the church, rather than kind of pulling back and waiting it out. But this is our opportunity to truly be the church. Amen.
And it may look different,
right,
because of restrictions and so on this summer, but it can be done. We're dealing with hundreds, thousands of churches every day who are coming up with lots of creative ideas on how to do it this summer with all of the restrictions and different challenges that we have. They're making it happen.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Love it, Thom. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And again, we'll have links to the resources you mentioned in the show notes. And we just certainly appreciate all that you and your team are doing for the church around the world. Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
I appreciate you taking the time to be with us on this week's episode. Every week, as we are putting the episodes together, we're thinking of you, our pastors and ministry leaders, and striving to provide insightful and inspiring interviews as you seek to grow as a kingdom leader. So we hope you're finding value from the Church Leaders podcast, and if so, we'd certainly appreciate you taking a few moments to head over to iTunes and leave us a review. Your positive reviews and ratings help other church leaders more easily find our podcasts, so they too can benefit from these interviews. Again, we thank you in advance, and if you have any comments, any questions, suggestions, or ideas for guests, I would love to hear from you. You can send me an email to podcast@ChurchLeaders.com, or you can connect with me on Twitter. Finally, you can find this podcast as well as other great faith-based podcasts on the FaithPlay app. It's available for both Apple and Android, and so we encourage you to check that out as well. So until next time, this is Jason Day, encouraging you to love well and lead well.
You've been listening to the Church Leaders Podcast. For articles, videos, and free resources that will help you lead better every day, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.